Hey everyone, you've stumbled upon Diverge Media. I'm your host and co-owner, Greg Staley, and today we'll be talking about experts weighing in on solitary confinement of children, the new recommendations from the government suggesting that we should isolate even classmates who were exposed to a child who tested positive for COVID-19. We will also be discussing Microsoft's AI patent that will allow chatbots to assume the personality of a dead relative and speak with you again. And of course, there's always more in the news. All right, let's get at it. Reported in the Toronto Sun by Anthony Fury, experts call Peel guidelines to place children in solitary quarantine cruel punishment. They say the drastic measures not supported by science could have long-lasting psychological effects. Peel Health has issued guidelines to parents instructing them to keep any children who have been sent home because a classmate has tested positive for COVID-19 isolated in a separate room from all other family members for 14 days. The severe guidelines, which may even apply to small children who are dismissed from childcare, are being criticized by experts as harmful and not supported by science. This is cruel punishment for a child, especially for younger children, for the 10 years old, Dr. Susan Richardson, a microbiologist and infectious disease physician at University of Toronto, wrote in the email to the Sun. Shutting a child off from their parents and siblings for up to 14 days in this manner could produce significant and long-lasting emotional and psychological effects. Here's what the government's recommending you do if your child is dismissed from school or childcare. Although it can vary depending on the municipality, here's what the generic advice is coming out of Peel region, and I can confirm it is the same in Niagara region. If your child does not have any symptoms, okay? So they were exposed to a classmate at school, Johnny got the sniffles, got a PCR test that is known to be problematic, saying it politely, okay? Wasn't recommended to diagnose viral illness by the creator of the test itself. And now we're using that. Johnny has the sniffles. Johnny tests positive for COVID-19. Johnny gets sent home. Your child now has to go home, and your child has no symptoms. This is what the government is telling them that you should do with your child. If your child does not have any symptoms, the child must self-isolate regardless of age. There is no age limit instructed in these guidelines. This means they must stay in a separate bedroom, eat in a separate room apart from others, use a separate bathroom if possible, and any other children who live at the same address should stay home from school or childcare as well, which means that a parent's going to have to stay home or hire somebody to watch the kids, or happen to have somebody in a situation that can actually watch their kids. If not, now they're losing income, all because Johnny had the sniffles. Minuscule chance of passing anything on to anyone. We don't get to know the cycle threshold that the positive case tested at for the outbreak to have occurred, but we're just to assume that they're infectious, even though there's less than a 3% chance, according to the medical studies, over any cycle threshold above 35. But here we are. This is Canada, of course, and everything COVID we must do to protect. Here's how this shook out in a real individual's life. Diverge Media had the privilege of speaking with a mother whose son had been placed into quarantine, whose son had been placed into forced self-isolation, or whose son was placed into self-isolation due to the recommendations. They wanted to get their lives back within 14 days, as was possible if he stayed self-isolated versus the 24 days if he didn't. Here's what the mom had to say. It started with Laura's grandmother, who said she had gotten sick. She had developed some fatigue, and she went to get tested, more so because her work kind of forced her to. And she found out that she had a positive PCR test. This led Laura to get her son tested because, quote, she said, I want to get him tested because he's definitely not going to be positive, and then I can get out of this. So I take him to get a test, and he is positive. After this ensues a whole bunch with public health. In Niagara region, where Laura lives, the rules for isolating COVID-19 cases don't make very much sense at all. In Laura's case, her son stays in his room self-isolated most of the time as he's a teenager anyways. But this isn't the case for all children. There is no age cutoff suggested with these recommendations. According to the Niagara region's website, if your child is not accessed by a healthcare provider and testing for COVID-19 was declined for any reason, we must assume the child has COVID-19. That is how we are living society, treating somebody with no symptoms simply because they refuse to get a test, which is known to have issues with it. Medical studies have covered the vast amount of issues with PCR. The creator himself even said, don't use this for diagnosis of illness, and here we are still using it for a pandemic. But I digress. The website says this child is to self-isolate for 10 days away from household members when possible, and all household contacts are to stay home and self-isolate for 14 days from the last exposure to the symptomatic child. So if you refused to get a COVID test, you were presumed to have COVID, which means you're presumed to be symptomatic. And in this case, the whole household had to stay home and self-isolate from 14 days after the last exposure to the child. So 24 days. If household members became symptomatic, they should consult their healthcare provider and or go for testing is what Niagara Region's website recommends. Now, in Laura's case, her son never had symptoms worse than a sore throat, which she described as less than a cold. However, under the Niagara Public Health Region's guidelines, she has to isolate for 14 days from the last exposure of the symptomatic child, her son. So Laura and her daughter both went to get tested at the behest of public health, and both were negative. After a negative test, Laura again spoke to public health and said they would only have to isolate until February 27th, so long as her son stayed in self-isolation. This all changed, however, the following day when she received another call from public health. This time they called and they called me back the next day and they say, his test came back as the UK variant. So now you and your daughter, you're quarantined until March 5th, whether he's isolated or not. Every subsequent call after that, they would just call me back, ask what his symptoms were, which was sore throat at the absolute most, but I'm going to say less than a cold. She continued. So every day they call me back and they want me and my daughter to go back and get tested. And I keep trying to explain to them, I can't do that because I'm not adding more time onto somebody who's tested negative. So if you go get a test and you happen to test positive and a runny nose considered a symptom, or a sore throat, or basically almost anything these days is considered a symptom of COVID, well then that extends the stay of the other person who tested negative. They have to wait till 14 days after the symptomatic person. That's when their isolation starts. So it's 24 days after the other person's done. She said, I asked them for an antibody test, which I know they can be mailed out, and it's a saliva test, so it's easy, and you get results in half an hour. So I'm like, well, I'm not going to keep going and getting tested unless me and my daughter are sick. If you're not going to send me a test that could tell me why I'm potentially testing negative. She said, I'm not going to let my life be on hold into April for a sore throat. It was at this point that public health told her that 24 days of isolation may no longer be long enough. In the phone call with Diverge Media, Laura told us that public health said, well, if you and your daughter aren't going to go back for another test, we're going to have to consult our doctors. 24 days may not be enough time. I said to them, if anything's past March 5th, I'll have a lawyer involved. Your calls are agitating me. They're stressing me out. So unless you have actual information to tell me, I need you to stop calling me. Laura went on to tell Diverge Media that after March 5th, she's done. She's going to walk out her front door. She has proof that she's tested negative, and she does personal training and has proof of her continuing to be active through her forced isolation. On a side note, Laura told us that her dad had also tested positive for COVID-19. She said, my dad, he tested positive, no symptoms. He was under the assumption that he had to get tested for work. So he went and got a test and it came back positive. Absolutely no symptoms. He's decided to take up running on the treadmill because he's bored. Are we ready to speak up as a Canadian populace yet? Do we not think this is utter ridiculous to be forcing isolation on children away from their families? Is this not even a thought in a politician's head that this may be wrong? Is this not even an afterthought after the policy's been made to say maybe these concerns need to be addressed? Has it occurred to any politician that they may have just sanctioned with guidelines the ability for a parent to abuse a child? Self-isolate your child of what? Daycare age? Childcare age. That's what it said. Isolate them away from the family? Are you kidding me? What kind of government advocates this kind of garbage advice? Oh, I know. I live under it. Microsoft now has a patent that will allow them to use users' social media content to create AI chatbots of dead relatives. Yeah, that's not Black Mirror, that's real life. Microsoft patent shows plans to revive dead loved ones as chatbots. Can you imagine somebody having access to all that information of your dead relative to put that into an algorithm so that it can be a dead AI chatbot? Originally reported in The Independent, the patent also mentions using 2D or 3D models of specific people. Yeah, this is literal Black Mirror type stuff. Now, Microsoft has been granted a patent that would allow the company to make a chatbot using the personal information of deceased people. The patent describes creating a bot based on the images, voice data, social media posts, and electronic messages and more personal information. The specific person who the chatbot represents may correspond to a past or present entity or a version thereof, such as a friend, a relative, an acquaintance, celebrity, fictional character, historical figure, a random entity, etc. And it goes on. The specific person may also correspond to oneself, the user creating/training the chatbot. Microsoft also implied that living users could train a digital replacement of themselves in the event of their death. Yeah. Microsoft has even gone as far as to create 2D and 3D models of specific people being generated via images, in-depth information, or video data. They even mention in the article Black Mirror specifically. They say the idea that you would be able in the future to speak to a simulation of someone who has passed on is not new. It is famously the plot of the Black Mirror episode Be Right Back, where a young woman uses the service to scrape data from her deceased partner to create a chatbot and eventually a robot. Yeah, we're actually heading down that road. As an example of this 3D technology, in October of 2020, Kanye West bought Kim Kardashian West a hologram of her late father, Robert Kardashian, to celebrate her 40th birthday, further cementing the idea of digital representations of the dead that can be more authentically communicate with the living. The hologram allegedly spoke for around 3 minutes, directly addressing Kardashian and her decision to become a lawyer. Apart from Microsoft, other tech companies have tried to use digital data to recreate loved ones of those who have passed on. Eugenia Kudya, co-founder of technology company Luca, used 8,000 lines of text messages between her and her friend Roman Mazurenko, who was killed in a road accident, to create a chatbot that mimicked Mazurenko's way of speaking. Speaking about that invention, here's what she said: "It's still a shadow of a person. But that wasn't possible just a year ago. And in the very close future, we will be able to do a lot more." Now, the patent itself in the abstract says examples of this present disclosure describe symptoms and methods of creating a conversational bot of a specific person in aspects, social data, images, voice data, social media posts, electronic messages, written letters, etc. about the specific person may be accessed. The social media may be used to create or modify a special index in the theme of the specific person's personality. What do you think of the Microsoft patent? Is it something that creeps you out as it does me? It is something that really turns me off. The idea that a Black Mirror episode is slowly becoming reality. It makes you wonder if Black Mirror itself is not something to stretch the viewer's imagination into the realm of possibility, as this is something that is already underway and being developed. Well, I want to go one more story of a man who's been constantly demonized in the mainstream media for being a heartless son of a gun who just doesn't care about people. I'm speaking of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. This man has been constantly demonized in the mainstream media for his approach to trying to allow people to have some semblance of normal in their approach. They didn't take the draconian approach of lockdown as many other places did. Now, this is what Ron DeSantis said at his opening speech for the Conservative Political Action Conference on Friday of last week. "Welcome to the oasis of freedom. Florida got it right and the lockdown states got it wrong." The Washington Times says, "Indeed, it did. Florida has lower per capita COVID-19 mortality than the national average and lower than 27 other states. Their rate up the middle of the pack, in fact, better than average, and did not lock down, including like those of the tightly locked down California, and despite having more senior citizens. Its unemployment rate is lower than the national average, and Florida offers more in-person education than any other state, and it leads the nation in vaccinating those that are older than 65. Its budget remains in good shape, with Mr. DeSantis declaring that he hasn't used a penny of Florida's rainy day fund to cover for pandemic-related expenses. Wouldn't that be a nice place for Canada to be in? Mr. DeSantis took an entirely different approach compared to other governors. In mid-April, Mr. DeSantis opened up the state's beaches. Critics were quick to say the move would lead to a massive death count and widespread COVID-19 contagion. Of course, it didn't, and Florida COVID-19 numbers remained steady after a peak in mid-July, just as many other places peaked at the exact same time. When the so-called experts said hospitals should discharge elderly coronavirus patients to nursing homes in the spring of last year, Mr. DeSantis refused. He said, "I think we're going to have enough hospital space at the time." Florida did, and thus avoided the needless elderly deaths, and they did avoid those deaths. For instance, like the ones that occurred in New York under Governor Cuomo. This fall, as more states were shuttering due to the coronavirus resurgence, Mr. DeSantis pushed to open the state's schools and businesses. And as a result, Florida has more schools open into in-person learning than the rest of the country, and Florida's economy is rebounding despite a lag in tourism. Mr. DeSantis said that we look around in other parts of our country, and in far too many places we see schools closed, businesses shuttered, and lives destroyed. While so many governors over the last year kept locking people down, Florida lifted people up. And this brings us to our last article of the day. Despite COVID-19, Alberta ICU admissions dropped in 2020. This according to a Freedom of Information request obtained by the Western Standard. Now, they were down a substantial amount from 24,010 to 22,409. Every single ICU in the province dropped except two that seen slight increases. Now, color me skeptical, but how is it that in the midst of a pandemic that has the media blaring out how I should be terrified for my life every single day, every time I walk outside, how is it that in the midst of a pandemic like that ICU numbers drop by thousands in Alberta? I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think is going on, but the reality is politicians have a lot of answering to do for a lot of questions that have yet to be asked. It is our job to ask those questions, and I'm calling on you to continue asking those questions to your MP and your local MPP. It is our duty as Canadians to ensure that we continue to ask the questions that matter so that Canadians can be informed. This is Greg Staley from Diverge Media. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.